Good morning. Welcome to Blackberry Abbey Conversations. I'm your host, Virginia.
And I'm Paul.
So today we are talking about how the different parts of our brains influence our behaviors and our personalities. And we were discussing earlier how there's a recent article in Psychology Today that had addressed how we're supposed to, or recommends rather, I should say, that we should use the mind rather than emotions. And so we wanted to dive deeper into just what the distinction is, because it turns out that we all know that the left part of the brain is more associated with logic, and the right side is more associated with emotions. And it is, in fact, really what people are referring to when they speak of the heart and the mind. You know, we don't. In earlier times, we were saying that the heart was seen as like, oh, this is the heart, but the heart it's up here, right?
Yeah.
So, did you want to elaborate?
Yeah. Well, I just mentioned the fact that these distinctions are not recent. Back in the time of the Greeks, they had the word logos, from which the word logic comes from, and they also had the word mythos, which is not what we would call myth today, but it's all the other side of your brain, your unconscious, your emotions, stories and feelings and relationships and so on. Mm-hmm. So the logos and mythos was very close to what the ancient Hebrews meant by mind and heart. Neither of them, of course, would have known there were two hemispheres of the brain. Mm-hmm. But in the last 100 years or so, we've realized that there are separate hemispheres of the brain in animals, birds, humans,
and very, very different. I mean, even color, brain, size,
different color, different size, different shape, and it begs the obvious question: why bother with two hemispheres when one much bigger one could do the job maybe better?
Well, but that there is, I mean, obviously there's two parts to serve two different purposes.
Well.
And like, it makes me think of this video this movie I just watched recently. Was it Girl on Fire or something like Girl on Fire? But essentially, she had I don't know if it was like an aneurysm, but she had some injury inside of her brain, and so I think it was I don't know. I'm not going to say which side of her brain it was, but essentially, she was only using one hemisphere, and where her injury was located, and she was displaying lots of aggressive behavior, and because a whole side of her brain was basically shut down. And so she was just she was erratic and
in fact, what you just said, one of the best ways they've figured out what the two separate hemispheres do. There are many ways they do brain imaging and brainwave analysis, but when people have a major stroke on the left side or the right side, and there have now been plenty of those, it changes your personality. Fortunately, like with kidneys, we can work with left brain or right brain adequately, but we work very differently. And scientists had noticed that birds and animals had these separate hemispheres. And basically, the left hemisphere was for getting food or attacking or something very specific and focused, whereas the right hemisphere was for looking 360 around, whether you had any friends or enemies approaching. And they discovered that humans behave approximately the same way, that we have a very laser-focused left brain, which is our rational mind, and the right hemisphere is very broad-ranging. So one of them is good at solving mathematical problems and logical things and programming computers, and the other one behaves quite differently.
Also about how in different cultures they tend to have more of an emphasis on utilizing both sides of their brain, whereas I think in my observation anyways, it seems in our Western world we're very left-brained oriented.
Increasingly. I mean, I'll just tell you from my own life story. When I went to college, I was a debater. and debate hinges on making arguments. And that's a classically left-brained way to go. And in fact, the reason I dropped out of debate is my friends told me, you're just arguing all the time. That's not good for you. And so I dropped out and realized there was more to life than arguing with people.
But that's interesting because you obviously had, you were obviously using enough of your right brain to be able to
Observe
or
yeah.
and even just absorb and recalibrate, right?
Right.
Whereas, I mean, if you don't know what you don't know, so if you were acting in a very left-brained manner and
I would have just argued more.
Well, exactly, but I mean, what I guess I'm saying is that what does this mean for every individuals who are watching this who may or may not be aware that that's their mentality simply because they're exercising so much of their left brain and not enough of their right brain.
There are people who think that mind is only the logical part, and what they used to call heart is now viewed just as an organ of the body, and it really doesn't mean anything to them. But over 50 years, people have realized they've come up with terms like emotional intelligence as one expression.
Yes.
And gut feel is also another expression of that, something that's different from your mind. And so gradually research continued. I have quoted, I think before, the Grant study at Harvard where they found that people who were warm and loving and giving toward other people actually did better in their careers, they did better with their families, they lived longer, they had a better life, the ones who used their heart. Obviously they used their brain, their logical brain as well. Nobody's ever suggested we should give that up.
No, it's about utilizing both, that there's science to support this gut, instinct as that being something substantial to depend on.
Well, business people have known about this for a very long time. My whole career for the last 50 years has been largely in business. And I remember reading a book, I'd say 30 or 40 years ago, that was called Planning on the Left and Managing on the Right. And they explained that you could make wonderful plans with the left-hand side of your brain, although I would argue that some of the right side of the brain is involved in that. The numbers part and all that would come in the left side. But the managing on the right, when you are a senior manager like I've been with hundreds and even thousands of people reporting to me, you don't often get more than 30 seconds to make your key decisions. And so you have to rely on the gut or on the intuitive mind or on direct insight. And you
can't take a second to go, wait a moment, I gotta look at my manual. I gotta do some research first.
And so they were very much aware of that. And it's not a new discovery. And mothers of children, I mean, you have to act instantly when there's danger in front of you. You don't have any time to reason it out. Well, if I go grab the child, will I have time before the fire burns it? I mean, by the time you think that thought, the child's already burned.
I think learning how to empower ourselves to know like what part when it's like
misleading.
Misleading because
conclusions.
we all can dream big. We can all have big feelings, but sometimes it's erratic, right? Sometimes it's a response in anger, and you can't always just act on your natural your first instinct.
Not always.
But to be empowered to go that yes, you have a built-in wisdom, center, so to speak, and I guess it's located somewhere in there, and to be able to exercise it and feel empowered to know when it's good to follow it. And I think that the more you have faith in your brain's ability to make good decisions for you based off of your gut, based off of your heart, what it's saying, I think
your insight.
Your insight, and you're bringing all sorts of things to the table, obviously. But I think if people could feel more empowered,
I want to just jump in another direction, and that is many scientists in the last 200 or 300 years have said that their great mathematical discoveries, scientific discoveries, and so on have come just in an insight. instant as an insight or an intuition. And I'll give you a quote from Albert Einstein, perhaps the greatest of them all. And he said, "The intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant." Now think of the order in which he put them. He said the intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. And the other person who wrote along that line is Dr. Ian McGilchrist, who's probably the most famous person in the world in studying the two hemispheres of the mind. And he calls his book The Master and His Emissary. And the master, in his phrase, is the right side of the brain, and the emissary is the left side of the brain. And he said, unfortunately, left brain people, the left side of the brain doesn't know much about the right side, but the right side understands the capabilities of the left side and uses them. But the left side, the argumentative side, doesn't even have any attention to give to the right side. And that sounds like a lot of the conversations we hear, debates and so on, where somebody thinks if they've come up with a bunch of arguments that they won, and they don't even hear when they're completely wrong.
No, they got a lineup, right? I mean, we've all watched the political debate or two where it's like they've got their lineup and they're sticking to their script, and it's like, go forth.
You know, one of the things we could ask is, how can we apply this in our own life?
Yes.
And I guess the first thing I want to say, where you were talking about earlier, is we need both hemispheres of the brain totally. And I'm not here to bash the left hemisphere, because I use that hemisphere of my mind a great deal.
Yes.
And I'm not here to say that that right hemisphere is always correct, because I've made far too many mistakes in intuitive leaps that turned out to be maybe near the target, but too far away not to make a mistake. Very smart people saying your gut feel is usually more reliable than your brain. I remember in New York when we were doing large financial transactions, our top instructor in that department said, look, you get a file and you look at all the information, and then you get a feeling, and then you go out and study it for a couple of weeks. And almost always you come to the same conclusion. And the other one that I've heard, many people will have heard this, is that when somebody walks into the room for an interview, the average person makes up their mind in 30 to 60 seconds.
Yeah.
And that's obviously the right brain working. Right. They can tell immediately when that person walks in, this one is not going to work.
Yes, yes.
Now, they will still go through all the investigations, and I'm not suggesting for a moment that we don't need to confirm our insights and our intuitions. But
we're just bringing awareness to that part of your brain that is so very active, and being aware of it. I think you're able to tap into more of its power.
Well, I found through the years, because I've been studying this phenomena for a long time, that I'm more hearing from inside the voice of my heart, or the inner voice, a lot more clearly than I would have when I was 20 or 25. All I heard was the arguments. And I was a characteristically left-brained person. And I thought if I could prove something to somebody logically, well, that was established. But then I discovered that no, it wasn't. So many times I could come up with 25 arguments in favor of something and still be absolutely dead wrong. Like, I'll give you an example. When I was in university, as a debater, for a while I was debating the Vietnam War. And I started off being pro-war and accepting the arguments of why it was needed. And then I had an opportunity to debate an older man who was not a very good debater, and in front of an audience, and everybody said, I won the debate. But strangely, after a week or two of thinking what this man had told me, I changed my mind, because I realized that although he was a poor debater, he spoke truth. And I was just giving reasons that were sort of a penny a pound.